Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Eugene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs.
Welcome to the Frontline Innovators podcast. I'm your host, Eugene Signorini, and as always, I'm excited for today's episode and our guest. Today's guest is a master certified executive coach by the Miko Leadership Institute, and also the author of the book, You're an Executive, but Are You a Leader?, which was #1 on Amazon in 4 leadership and management categories. She currently serves as CEO at Executive Leadership Consulting. Please welcome to the show, Sonya Shelton. Sonya, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
I'm really excited to dig in today. We've got some great stuff to talk about. And one of the things we always like to start out asking our guest is kind of a big picture question, which is, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing the deskless workforce today?
Yeah, I want to kind of zoom out for a second and talk about what's happening in the world right now. So we have a pandemic, we have supply chain issues, we have high turnover and the Great Resignation and a talent shortage, and we have this speeding up of technology, and it's all hitting at the same time. And the frontline workers are actually taking the brunt of it. So if you look at all of those categories, the front line is at the front line of every single one of those things. And it's resulting in a lot of, I would say, burnout, fatigue, and anxiety. I think there's some research that came out that a high percentage, between 70 and 80% of Gen Z and millennials, are feeling anxiety as a result of work, right? And I think it's looking at that challenge is hitting the front line from every angle, and we don't know how long that's going to last. We don't know how what else is going to come up, and it's really a time of uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a common theme that we're hearing today, the uncertainty. The other thing you mentioned is the anxiety, which I think is a really big issue. I think frontline workers in general, just like everyone, have their anxieties around work, and it seems to be only getting exacerbated these days.
Yes, absolutely. And it's something that we need to address as leaders, right? Leaders in the organizations to think about their mental health and help them get through it with all of these changes that are happening.
So I think that's a great segue, because there's the title of the program is Frontline Innovators, right? And we talk a lot about frontline workers. I know you deal a lot with executives, and executives are the furthest away from the front line, but certainly you have experience in kind of connecting those two different personas. I'd love to talk a little bit about maybe you can tell us about Executive Leadership Consulting and what you do and your organization does to kind of help leaders, particularly as they're kind of facing some of these challenges that you just described.
Yes, absolutely. So where our focus at Executive Leadership Consulting is on aligning the business strategy with the culture. So sometimes organizations will lean more towards one side or the other, where they're more focused on their business strategy and not paying attention to the culture, or the culture just sort of evolves organically. And then other companies are really focused on the culture and not so focused on the business strategy, and that can impact their growth, right? So we look at how can you get them working together and align. So we say, there's that quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and we say actually they need to have breakfast together. So that's how we help leaders, and from every level, from the executive team all the way to the front line.
Yeah, first of all, I love that quote. I think it's been attributed to Peter Drucker, although that may be apocryphal. But I may be stealing your quote from now on to use in presentations and such, because I love that they need to eat breakfast together. I do think it's rare, right, to hear those two things talked about in conjunction. And I think it's especially important today in light of some of those things that you mentioned just a few minutes ago.
Yeah, absolutely. What in the context of uncertainty, especially, what helps, even think of for yourself, like where do you get centered in times of uncertainty? It's creating some certainty. So, maybe breaking it down to smaller pieces, or really focusing on the purpose, the why we're doing what we're doing. And so, helping leaders get, starting with that purpose and their vision, and making sure that they have that sense of meaning and belonging at every level of their organization, tied to the business, right? So it's not just culture for the sake of culture, or trying to make people feel good. It's how do they have purpose and meaning behind what they're doing.
Yeah. So, and obviously, I'd love to talk about, how you kind of got here. I know that, you've had experience at companies, working at companies which have kind of some very unique cultures, right? And great leadership. Walt Disney Company comes to mind, right? So talk a little bit about how you kind of, evolved in your career to kind of get to where you are in kind of trying to connect and help other leaders, make that connection between strategy and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually started my career in journalism, and then went to marketing and advertising. So communication has always been part of an aspect of what I do. And before starting ELC, I did work at the Walt Disney Company as the head of internal communications. And I worked there at a unique time when we had a shareholder revolt, where a member of the Disney family was ousting the CEO, Michael Eisner. So as the head of internal communications, had a front row seat to this concept of strategy and culture, and also what can happen in an organization when leadership is disrupted. And just saw the opportunity to help other organizations as we got through that at Disney, and ended up in a very positive and growth oriented trajectory after that. Saw that I could help other companies with that, and started ELC at that time.
So, it's clear you've got a way with words, right? From that, flipping the old quote on its head. But I also love the title of your book. You're an executive, but are you a leader? So talk a little bit about the book, like how did it come about? And then I'd love to maybe dive in a couple of highlight points of what's the difference between an executive and a leader? What makes an executive a leader?
Yeah, absolutely. The book actually came out of my own personal story, where it was when I was at Disney, and I grew up in a family of entrepreneurs. Like, we had talked about, my parents were talking business and leadership at the dinner table every night. And so I kind of got that by osmosis. I didn't realize, my connection to leadership, how much I learned from my parents until later. But while I was at Disney, I got a 360 survey review. So getting feedback from different parts of different people that I worked with. And my team said, the feedback that I got from them was, you're running so fast ahead of us that we can't keep up with you. And we've kind of given up wanting to. And it was like a stab to the heart. Right. And I realized that, that we can fall into, and it connects to the culture piece too, because we can fall into the culture that we're living in, and kind of, even if it's not who we think we are, we sort of fall into how the culture is. And it was just a realization that a lot of leaders go through that, and relying on the strength of their position, or running up the hill towards the vision so fast that the team can't keep up with them. And that's what led to me wanting to help other leaders with it.
And so, maybe some finer points of the, or high level points of the book. I would encourage folks. I've read some of it myself. I know you provided to me graciously. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to getting through the rest of it. I would encourage folks to take it out. But, if you were to kind of high level, what's the difference between executive or what makes an executive a true leader?
Yeah, I think that it's recognizing that you need to have followers, right?
Mhm.
So if you're just relying on your position or your title, or the quote unquote power that the organization has given you through that title, then you have compliance. You don't have followers, right? So it's really about how can you inspire people and lead them towards a vision. And I talk in the book about creating one vision, one voice, and one direction, so that you can and it connects to these times of uncertainty, right? So that you can move faster, and everybody understands where we're going, they understand their role, and they understand how we're going to get there.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you kind of had you talked about that review you received, and that line just really kind of resonated with me, which is I think you said you're moving so fast that we can't keep up with you, and we've stopped trying or don't even want to anymore. I think about that when I think about, you talked about all the change that's happening, particularly to the front line. So we bring it back to the frontline worker. I feel like there's probably that sentiment among many frontline workers in organizations, particularly today, which is we can't keep up, right? And when you feel like you can't keep up, it's like we've just stopped trying. So I'd love you to kind of connect the dots a little bit, which is okay. What are you seeing? How are you seeing then leaders and executives, right, trying to make that connection back to their frontline? As I said, they're probably the most removed, right, from their frontline workforce, and those frontline workforces are probably the most important to the success of their business. So have you seen any examples where companies have started to kind of really rethink their approach to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies lose sight of what being a frontline worker means, right? So they're on the front line, which means they're closest to the customer. And one organization that I worked with in China, they were the company had a hotel and 3 restaurants, and the CEO there, actually, when he showed me his org chart, it was actually flipped upside down. So the frontline workers were at the top of the org chart, and he was at the bottom. And I loved his philosophy, because he said, and I stayed in his hotel and I ate at a couple of the restaurants, and I have never had such an incredible customer experience in my life, a guest experience in my life. And I didn't speak the language, so even more so, right? So, but he looked at it like those frontline workers are the closest to our guests, and we have to make sure that they have everything they need to be able to provide those guests with the best possible customer experience, right? So everybody in the organization, all the way down to what he would say down to the CEO, right? Is their whole job is to make sure that those frontline workers can be the best they can be and deliver the best service they can be. And I think it's sometimes when we have that our upright pyramid looking at the organization that way, we lose sight of the fact that those are the people that are helping make the money, right? Those are the people that are the make or break of the success of the company at every level, right? So rather than having them be at the bottom, really putting them as your top priority to make sure that they have everything they need to be able to do what they do.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic anecdote. And it also gets me thinking back to one of the other things you said, which is, in order to be a leader, you have to have followers. And it almost feels like in this case, they've kind of flipped it where the CEO is following the lead from the front line, which is kind of a very interesting way to kind of think about that problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was interesting was this was at a different time, right? So I wasn't when there was a talent shortage, but he constantly had turnover from other companies trying to poach his people because they were the best at customer service. But when they would go to those other companies, they didn't show up the same because they didn't have that support, right? So his competitors thought they were buying a certain talent, and what they were actually buying was the leadership.
Yeah. And I guess it connects back to culture, right? Because you can bring in an employee, but you can't necessarily bring in or replicate that culture, right?
Right.
Just by bringing in an employee. So, I'd love to peel back the onion on this a little bit, right? Which is to say, like, it's great. It sounds like, an org chart is one thing, right? Flipping the org chart, anybody can literally flip an org chart upside down, right? On a piece of paper or on a PowerPoint slide. But obviously there's more to it than that. And obviously you experience it was like, well, something is going on beside just flipping that diagram upside down, because you experienced it firsthand. No, this is a fantastic culture. So what are kind of the steps, right? That organizations and leaders need to put in place to create, as you said, that foundation to support that frontline workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's, going back to that purpose and vision. Does everybody understand where we're going as an organization, and why? Why are we doing what we're doing? And then looking at the people, like, so not just from that bigger picture, what's our purpose and vision, but what is your specific role contributing to that? And then, and what is our plan to get there? And really looking at, and looking at every dimension. I see so culture is looking at every dimension of the organization. From, do you have the right processes in place? Do you have the right training? Do you have the right organizational structure? So, and do people understand their roles? And then looking at also times of celebration, right? So I think sometimes, especially in the times that we're in right now, in times of uncertainty, we can lose sight of making sure that we're celebrating those small wins along the way. And the research shows actually that we have our best days when we feel like we've accomplished something that day, right? When we've made progress towards a goal. So really looking for those opportunities to say, maybe there's this bigger picture goal that you have, but what are the small things that you can celebrate to keep people going and keep people motivated, and see that they're making progress and they're not just on a treadmill, or they're just they don't see the end in sight in the times of uncertainty, feeling like there's little milestones along the way where they're feeling like they're achieving something.
Yeah, it certainly seems like that's very important these days, because you said, like, that feeling of accomplishment, have accomplished something. And I'm sure these days where we've got staff shortages, where people are, being asked to do more, right, with less, it probably doesn't, they probably feel like they haven't accomplished anything because they're so underwater.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of it, the other end is probably companies don't feel like they have the time to set aside to kind of celebrate those little successes. Right. Are there any kind of, what are some of the ways that companies can do that in a crazy time, a time where it doesn't seem like they have any time to do that?
Yeah, I think it's redefining what you mean by celebration.
Yep.
Right. So it doesn't necessarily mean having a party or happy hour or bagels in the morning or things like that. It's actually connecting with people emotionally, right? Saying, Gene, I saw that you met your goal today for the things that you needed to get done. That's really great. That is moving us towards our vision, and this is how. Right. It's taking that 10 seconds to actually appreciate them and have gratitude. And in times of uncertainty, we need to build up our resilience, and gratitude and appreciation go a long ways, not only for building up that resilience, but also building up trust with your teams.
Yeah. So, you mentioned your background in communications and your role at Walt Disney Company. And then you talked about this concept of, making sure that everyone understands kind of the vision, right? That's communicated through, or everybody understands it. So, communication obviously plays a large part in that. Can you talk a little bit about, best practices for communication, or maybe where you've seen companies struggle in really disseminating that message and making sure everybody is and truly on the same page?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll actually use digital transformation as a way to think about this, right? So I know
Yeah.
a lot of your audience are involved
Yep.
in digital transformation. So making it applicable there, so if you're looking at your project, what is the purpose of the project? Why are we doing this? What's the vision of the project, right? Do we have the right people involved? So what will it look like? What is this going to do for you? What is it going to do for not only for the company, but what is this going to do for you, right? So a lot of digital transformation projects hopefully are designed to make things easier for the front line, even though it might feel harder at first, right? But to keep them focused on what's in it for them at the end, and why is it worth going through this, and it might be in that time of change a little bit more challenging, but why is it worth it? And I think it's one of the examples that I use when I do seminars or workshops with people when it comes to communication is the importance of consistency. And an exercise that I use is I have them, I say, you can't reach into your pocket or your wallet. Now draw a penny. And how many hundreds, maybe even millions of times have you seen a penny in your lifetime? And no one can draw it, right? And it's sort of a, they remember certain aspects of it, but they don't remember details. And it's like, that's how communication is, right? We might remember, a couple of points, but we might not remember everything we were told. And if we're not hearing it consistently, then we're not going to remember it. And so it's the same with the vision. If you're not talking about it consistently and not just repeating it, but looking at, oh, this team over here achieved this goal or completed this project or reached this milestone, and this is how it's moving us towards our vision. Here's another example of how we're making progress towards our vision, or this person came up with this idea, and this idea is how it's going to help us get to our vision, right? Looking at different opportunities to keep bringing it back in different ways.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I'm glad you brought up a digital transformation as an example, because I find when it comes to digital transformation efforts, a lot of companies focus on the technology piece, right, and not so much on the change management element, right? Whether that's communication or training, as you mentioned. What are you seeing? What do you see from companies when they're, specifically when they're talking about technology change or digital transformation? Are they kind of aware of the need for these elements, or are they kind of slow saying, oh yeah, we hadn't really kind of thought about, where do they start to think about it? I guess my question should be, do they really think about it at the beginning when they're thinking about those transformation initiatives?
Yeah, I think one of the things I just read made me think about this differently, in that I think it was Dell that was talking. They did a survey of organizations to say, how many organizations are looking at doing digital transformation. It was something like 80%.
Yeah.
But what stood out to me was that 50% of those said, we don't think that we can do it fast enough. And where I see the danger in that is that they will look past the people aspect, right? That the more, what I see a lot of organizations doing is sort of, oh, well, we'll get to that later when it's time, when we're going live, and we'll do the communications and training, at the end. And for us, that change process happens at the very beginning, starting with the executive level, right? We've seen time and time again, projects get halted, delayed, canceled because executives weren't on board. They didn't approve the budget, or they didn't understand the changes, and that wait, we have to stop everything until we get clear about this. And so we start at the very, very beginning, at that executive level, to make sure that you have alignment, that you have agreement, that everybody understands, again, what's in it for them. Like, how are these changes going to impact them, and their role and their people?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because people generally don't associate, or maybe it's just me, but I think generally you don't associate change management with strategy, right? Change management seems very tactical, right, compared to strategy. So I've and I know we've had a couple conversations. So, to me, you connecting those dots makes sense, but I'd love you to help the audience a little bit and saying, well, how do you connect the dots between, the tactics of change management with, the overall organization strategy? They just seem so far apart.
Right. Well, in an ideal world, the change would have been part of the strategy, right? So, and in some cases, depending on the company and the leadership, as you were mentioning, the executive levels being so far away from the front line, they know why. They understand the strategy behind the change, but aren't necessarily sharing that, right? And so it's connecting those dots, making sure that that change is part of a bigger strategy. And I'll actually give you an example of a client where it went wrong.
Okay. Yeah.
And
those are some of the best examples, right? Because you can learn from them. Yeah.
Right. Where there was a change that was happening on the front line, and the business strategy, and it was costing millions of dollars to launch a new technology. And what was happening at the strategy level was to actually cut that area of the company, and the business strategy was to no longer do that. But there was a disconnect between what was happening at the strategic level and what was happening at that execution level, and all of that time and money and investment wasted because there wasn't a connection between the strategy and the change. And of course, that's something that's more confidential, so that the people who are actually working on the change didn't know about it. But if they would have been more connected to the executive level and had those conversations, they would have said, oh, well, they could have said, well, let's wait and delay this maybe 6 months because there's some other things that are happening in the organization that might affect it. And so the company ended up wasting millions of dollars just because they didn't have alignment between the strategy and the change.
Interesting. So I'm curious also, in your conversations with executives and leaders in organizations, when you're talking about strategy and culture, right? How does technology, right, and digital transformation fit in? Are you seeing it increasingly intertwined with those discussions?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say you can see it's almost like what happens in a digital transformation project is a symptom of what you're seeing in alignment or misalignment between the strategy and the culture, right? So, going back to, does everybody understand why we're doing this digital transformation? Is it naturally common sense because the strategy has been communicated so much that this is part of course, this is part of what we need to do to get where we want to go, right? As opposed to, oh, this is a change, it feels burdensome. And then also, collaboration, right? And looking at, some of the things around digital transformation that we've seen is the importance of making sure that everybody understands who's going to be touching it, right? Mm-hmm. So it might not be somebody who's impacted by it, right? It might not be the frontline worker who's going to actually be implementing that, but it might be somebody who works in data, or this particular process over here that has an input into this new technology, but nobody's really talking to them. And then suddenly it comes up, oh, well, we need this from you, and they say, oh, I don't have time for that, right? It wasn't part of my strategy, right? So when you have that connection between understanding why we're doing what we're doing, and when the strategy is clear, those changes become don't become challenging in the same way, right? They're still challenging, but they're more in a positive way because this is what we need to do to get where we want to go. And then there's also, again, back to communication. Everybody knows about it because it's part of the strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable point, right? Is kind of what I'm hearing is like recognizing where are all the touch points, right? Or where are the intersection with what we're doing and all the points where this is going to impact. I know from our experience and in some of my previous experience, in digital projects is, it's often overlooked, like one part of the organization may have a very small piece of what needs to be done, but people forgot that they needed to be involved. And then all of a sudden the entire project is at a minimum held up, right? Or, could lead to some unforeseen failure down the line.
Right.
So I think it's a great point. And the other thing, when we talk about the frontline workforce, making sure we're kind of communicating with them and reaching them. I love that, what's in it for them, right? And that's a theme that we've heard from others on this program as well, right? It's not enough to kind of talk about what's in it for the business. It is, how is this going to help you, right? But I also think one of the challenges that we've seen is just the actual nuts and bolts of actually communicating with the front line, right? Because often that happens through many layers of management, or through their supervisor, and then you've got multiple supervisors, and frontline workers are very distributed. In some ways, they're not as well connected as the knowledge workers in your organization. What are some of the things, just from a purely tactical standpoint, that you've seen is like, okay, well, how do we best communicate with those employees?
Yeah, what I've seen work the best is getting into their flow, right? So, which means understanding their world, right? Right. So it's not trying to hand down talking points to managers, or, kind of trying to make it top down, but really looking at what's the flow of their day? How do they normally get communications? And it might be different parts of, or different types of roles get communications different ways. And it's inputting into that flow that's already happening, right? So they're getting direction from their supervisors or their managers already, team leaders, right? So so it's how can you give them the tools to just slip that into what they're already doing? And so it's not another thing they have to do in an already stressful time. And it might mean, for communications people, having to do a little bit more work and customization, and not having just a one size fits all approach, but really looking at, so what do we need to do to help this type of role, and what do we need to do to help that type of role, to make sure that we're getting into their already established routines, rather than trying to make something different.
Yeah. I think the irony, of course, is also that, let's take a digital transformation project or something for a frontline workforce. Very often, as you said, those workers have anxiety about it. One of the anxieties we hear all the time is that they think this is just a means for the company to kind of keep tabs on what I'm doing, right? To make sure what I'm doing. And it often seems like the technology is put in place as a one-way mirror, if you will, right? And I think that those technologies could be flipped and said, no, this is also a tool for you to better understand what's happening, not only around you, but in the organization, more broadly in the organization. But traditionally, those tools haven't been necessarily provided for the frontline workforce.
Yeah, and I think going back to the upside down org chart, right? It's really looking at what do they need to best serve the customer they're serving. And if you don't know that, then, and you're not looking at that ahead of time, saying the digital transformation plan may already be in place, but if you're not having those conversations, what are your pain points today? What are some of the challenges that you're facing in your processes today? And connecting the dots between what's happening with the technology and their problems, then you're missing an opportunity, right? To say, so then now the technology is an answer to their problem, as opposed to something that becomes policing, right? So I think, in communications, that two-way street, and having the opportunity to understand their world and to get their feedback as well into what's working and what's not working. And one of the things that our team does whenever we're helping a company with digital transformation for frontline is we do a day in the life. Like we send one of our consultants to spend a day with somebody and see, like, what is their world, what are they dealing with, and what are some of the challenges that they're seeing. And then that makes it easier on the change side to say, okay, so then what training do they need as a result of this? What, beyond just the technology itself, do they need additional types of training? And then also, what's the best way to communicate with them, and how would we talk about this, now that we understand their world a little bit better?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up training. I'd love to pull on that thread a little bit. You mentioned it a bit earlier as well. And obviously we talked about the communication pieces as a critical element, but there's also that training piece. Have you seen companies taking kind of a different or a renewed approach to thinking about or how they think about training in their organizations?
Yeah, I think that, I think it's become definitely something that's become more top of mind,
Yeah.
Especially with the high turnover, the great resignation, talent shortage. When you have high turnover with people coming and going, I think companies are really looking at how do we put training practices in place that are ongoing, right? So that we can make sure that whoever's coming in gets the best training, and that might look like more automated training. It might, but actually putting something in place that's a standardization of training. And I've seen a lot of companies actually doing a buddy system, where the new person that comes in, they're getting their training from the company and from their supervisor or their manager, but they also have a peer that is somebody that they're buddied with, to understand they can go to with questions, that they can ask things they might be embarrassed to ask their boss, right? So that they have somebody that can, like a peer mentor, that can help them as they're onboarding. It also helps develop relationships and connect to the culture and how things work around here, beyond just the normal processes.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I think there's a couple of things there. One is this aspect of training as a continual process, right? I think most often people think of training as like, okay, it's one and done, right? You've got your upfront training and you're good to go, and they may never hear from you again, right? And I think also the other thing you illustrate is just a challenge of reaching that frontline worker with training, right? And the ways it's traditionally been done. A lot of it, like you said, has been their manager, and we've talked to companies and organizations who it's, so, well, how do you train your people? Well, it's typically a 1 week ride along with their supervisor, and then hopefully by the end of that, they know what they're doing. So this kind of peer, I think you talked about a couple of things. One is this, the ability to have peers that they can tap into, and the ability to have access to resources, right, that they continuously can go back to when they need it. So it's refreshing to kind of hear that you're seeing some of those things begin to emerge, particularly for the frontline audience.
Yeah, and I think for me personally, what's a really cool side benefit of the peer, the buddy system with the peers, is that for those people who are acting as the peers, you're starting to develop some leadership skills, right? So they're not necessarily that person's leader, but they're developing leadership skills to think about, how would I answer this question? How can I coach them to do this better? And in a low risk way for them to develop the skills.
Yeah. It's interesting. We had a conversation with a large retailer not too long ago, and it was surprising. I had not spoken with them before, but they really talked about training as something central to their culture, or very important to their culture. They looked on it as, this is something that we you could tell in that conversation, it's something they took pride in, right? And not only that, but felt it was a true competitive advantage. I'd just be interested in your perspective. Do you hear a lot of companies thinking about it that way? Or in your conversations with executives and leaders, is it too far abstracted for them?
Yeah, I think they might talk about it a little bit differently in coming with a growth mindset, and how can we be a learning organization, right? So not just the training of standards, but how can we question what we're doing, how we're doing it? Is it the right thing? Do we need to pivot? Do we need to be more agile? How can we learn from mistakes and be able to surface those all the way to the front line, right? To say, empowering people to step up and say, they're allowed to say, this isn't working, and I can see a way that maybe we can do this better, and to make their own jobs more fulfilling. But they also feel like, again, to those times of uncertainty and anxiety, that they feel like they have some say in how things are going, when they're able to share ways of doing things more efficiently or more productively.
Yeah. Do you see companies, having a greater recognition? We always talk a lot on this show, especially about the differences between kind of knowledge workers or office-based workers versus the frontline. are you seeing companies, really kind of taking a dramatically different approach to them, at least from a tactical standpoint, even though we're trying to treat them the same culturally, right? We know we need to disseminate, everybody in the organization, whether they're in accounting or they're on the retail floor, right, have to have the same understanding of the vision as you talked about. But how are they kind of think about it tactically to say, okay, we've got different roles and different people and different needs. How does that kind of play into the things that you've been talking about today and the conversations you have with your executive leaders?
Yeah, and I even think about to my days at Disney, right? You have a general culture of a company and a vision for the company, but then you have all these subcultures within the organization too, and it can be by level. It can be by the division or the type of business they're in. So when I think about at Disney, like how we communicated and how we connected to a cast member that works in a theme park is completely different than how we would communicate with a journalist at ABC News or somebody at ESPN or somebody who's making a movie at the studios, right? They all have, because of the business they're in, they have completely different ways of seeing the world, completely different cultures. And I think it's the same thing with knowledge workers and the deskless workers on the front line. They have their own type of culture just because of the work that they do, right? So it's understanding that and allowing that and encouraging that, but also seeing that it's part of a bigger picture. So I talk to my clients. So I live in Los Angeles, and I talk to my clients about, I live in Los Angeles. I have a connection to Los Angeles because I live here. I also consider myself a Californian because I live in California, and I also consider myself an American because I live in the United States, right? So it's the same thing, and the culture in Los Angeles is very different from the culture in Cleveland, right? So, but that doesn't mean that we still feel like we're both Americans. We still have a connection that way, right? So it's kind of looking at culture in a larger organization that way, where you have this bigger culture of the company, but then you also have subcultures that are just as important and just as effective and also need to be fostered.
Yeah. And I think it's, you mentioned this concept of doing kind of the day in the life. And that's something that we do at Skillful as well. We highly encourage, we've got the saying is you can't design a solution from a boardroom. Right. And, I think that's great. I imagine though, that there's probably a disconnect in some cases from executives, right? From really understanding the day in the life of some of their frontline employees. I mean, have you, what are the things that you recommend to them to kind of get over that hurdle? Do you see that disconnect sometimes? Do you kind of walk in to a client engagement and say, I don't know that they really get their, I imagine that CEO and the Chinese hotelier, you clearly, probably clearly got it right away. This guy gets it. He understands his folks. And then you may get in other situations where it's like, I think there's a pretty big disconnect here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to, when I'm coaching leaders on their leadership, where I've seen really strong connection are those executives that actually spend time on the front line. They're coming to their location. They're spending time understanding them. They're talking to them. They're doing walkarounds, right, in factories and things like that to say, what is life like here, and stopping and talking to people and really giving a chance to have that dialogue and understand some of the challenges that they're facing. And what I've seen is that the executives that do that not only understand their business better, but they understand their customers better, and they're able to see some of the challenges. And I would say there's definitely a correlation between the leaders that do that and the learning organizations, right? So leaders that are wanting to learn and create a culture of learning are the ones that are really staying close to and learning about their frontline workers.
Yeah. So I usually kind of wrap up the conversation with kind of a what do you love about what you do and what you hate about what you do? I think I'm going to find it difficult for you to come up with an answer to the second part of that for you. at least having talked to you for a few minutes, it seems you're pretty passionate. And I usually ask this around technology because people generally have a love and hate with technology who work in it. But what's the thing that you love the most about kind of doing this leadership and executive culture, executive of consulting?
Yeah. So I believe personally, my number one value is contribution, right? So how can I contribute to a bigger cause? And so for me personally, this is really about, we spend the majority of our waking hours at work. And if we are not fulfilled, that pretty much means that our life isn't fulfilled, right? And it can bleed into personal life, and it can, if we're not happy in our jobs, it can bleed into every other aspect. And so I love what I do, and I'm passionate about what I do because I can see that turnaround happen when somebody goes from struggling in their job or not really liking their job into finding meaning in it and finding fulfillment, and seeing how they're contributing, and that they also are making a contribution through the work that they do, can change their whole life, right? And so that's why I do what I do. That's why I love what I do. And leaders maybe not always have the perspective that how they show up can impact somebody that way, right? But I will say that I think the frustration is the there's nothing that I hate about my job for sure, but I think the frustration is how hard it is to get leaders to think about, and to even get organizations to think about the people as a priority, right? To say there needs to be absolutely 100% that business strategy, but also the importance of culture in connection to that business strategy can really drive competitive advantage. So yeah, it's my mission to try to get that awareness out as much as possible.
Yeah. And I mean, you can't execute on the strategy, right? You can come up with the plan, but you can't execute it without the people in your organization to get it done. Right.
Right.
So Sonya, this has been a wonderful conversation, some great insights, and I think some very unique insights for the program. I think it's been great. Where can people find you if they want to talk to you personally? Is LinkedIn a good place to reach out?
Yes, absolutely. LinkedIn, Sonya Shelton at Executive Leadership Consulting. You can find me there. I'm constantly providing content on LinkedIn as well. So if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll get lots of free consulting and coaching because I'm constantly putting content up there as well.
And are you a big tweeter at all? Are you on Twitter?
I am. My largest following is on Twitter, actually.
Oh, awesome. So what's your Twitter handle for the folks listening?
My Twitter handle is @Sonya Shelton.
And your company website is executiveleader.com, correct?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And also be sure to check out Sonya's book, You're an Executive, But Are You a Leader? And it's available on Amazon, correct? And
yes,
that's awesome. I highly recommend people to check that out. Sonya, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time and joining us and speaking with our audience today.
Thank you very much for being here. It was a great conversation.
Thanks. So we'll wrap it up here. I hope those listening have found this conversation as enjoyable as I have. If so, please share and rate the podcast. 5-star ratings help ensure that it gets promoted to other professionals like you that are innovating on the front lines. And just a friendly reminder, this podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the mobile digital adoption platform for deskless and frontline workers. You can visit the Skillful website at skyllful.com. And if you or someone you know is out there innovating on the front lines, we'd love to hear about it. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn and share your story. Until then, see you on the next episode.